Well, good evening, everybody. I think I'm reliably informed that it's gone 6 o'clock, so if I could perhaps start the meeting and ask for any apologies first off.
None received, Chair.
No, I haven't heard any. No, so no apologies. If we might move then to the minutes of the previous meeting. Any? No, it's not favourable, is it? No. So if we look through those, and if anybody has any points they'd like to, yes, Roy. Sorry, Councillor Mantell.
Roy, could you use the microphone?
On page number 6, the third point from the bottom, I asked a question and the monitoring officer answered it as he did and as is recorded. And my question came about because of the term "no further action," which concludes many of our cases. And the monitoring officer explained that you go to the complainants to explain to them why a particular decision has been reached, and that would be quite a good thing. Is a good thing to do. I wonder, reading this minute and thinking about it, whether it would be equally useful for the, if you like, the defendant in the case to hear that same explanation rather than the term "no further action." That's my question.
Well, I think that's a very good one. Andrew, I don't know if can I ask you to take over?
Yes, if I could, Chair. Yeah, it is a good point. Just to clarify, as I said at the last meeting, yes, I do write to the complainant and explain why no further action, but equally the subject member, the member subject to the complaint, I also give them a longer response than just those 3 words of "no further action." So I do explain why I've come to that conclusion to the subject member as well.
I was once the subject of a complaint which had a malicious element in it, but and I'm pleased to hear that the complainant received this letter. From memory, I think I got a phone call from one of the officers, and he explained to me that it was decided no further action by a unanimous decision of the chairman of the committee, the monitoring officer, and the independent person, which was satisfactory to hear. But I can't remember a further explanation or a letter. But well, that is my point.
Well, I think that's a very valid point, and it's something that perhaps we can address in more detail at a future meeting, if that would be acceptable. Right, we'll make sure that's on the agenda. Thank you. So we're moving on then, on to page 7, if everyone's happy. Oh, I do beg your pardon, yes. Are there any questions?
There were no questions of any type for this evening, Chairman, so you can now move on.
That's lovely, thank you. Because I know we're perhaps a little bit constrained for time. Not that I want anybody to feel rushed at all, but it's useful to be mindful. Thank you. So with no questions at all then, so the next item. It's yeah,
Page 9?
I think it is, isn't it? Yes, thank you. Page 9. Which is the report from our monitoring officer. So
It's the presentation, training item.
yeah, there's the presentation and training item on page 9. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, actually slightly premature. It's not the report on page 9. I just wanted to spend just a few minutes giving you a very short presentation around the member code of conduct. And if I can get the technology to work, I'm just going to bring up the presentation on the screen now for us in the chamber and all those people who will be watching this meeting online. He said, hopefully. So we go. Let me just make it. There we go. Right, so the committee will remember that at the last meeting you asked for some brief training at the start of each meeting. So tonight I was going to start with the member code of conduct. Just a few short slides here just to give you some background and context, and then through the chair any questions that you may have around what I've got to say. So the purpose is set out there. What I wanted to do though is sort of try and contextualize this. So it isn't just about member code of conduct in isolation, but it's showing how it fits into the council's overall arrangements for good governance, and in particular the council's local code of corporate governance, which I'll say a little bit about in a second. And also recognising that the member code of conduct is just one of a range of different codes of conduct that we've got in the council. And I just wanted to make the point that for officers, there is an officer code of conduct, which is equally in play in terms of the council's overall governance arrangements. But so just to say a little bit about good governance, first of all. So Wokingham in 2020 agreed its latest version of its local code of corporate governance, and it's based on SITFA, who are the public sector accountancy body, and SOLIS, the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives, their sort of best practice around governance in local authorities. And our code in the Borough Council mirrors the SITFA SOLIS best practice. And the best practice covers those 7 principles there. I'm very happy to share with the committee a copy of the code or send you the link. It's on the council's website. But tonight, we're just going to focus on that first bullet there in particular. So the behaviours side, which, as I say, obviously applies to members through the member code of conduct, but equally applies to officers through the officer code of conduct itself. So just in terms of what the law says about member code of conduct, well, every council, borough, town, parish has to have a code of conduct. It's the law, it's not discretionary. And the law says that we need to adopt a code based on those 7 principles of public life, the so-called Nolan principles. The code needs to include mandatory interest provisions, which I'll talk about in a second. It needs to cover arrangements in terms of how we deal with allegations of breaches against the code, and how the borough, as the principal authority in this area, is responsible for dealing with member code of conduct complaints against town and parish councillors. And the law also requires the principal authority to appoint at least one independent person. I think I've said previously to the committee that we're fortunate at the moment that we've got 3 independent persons to call on to help us when we've got complaints. And I will talk at the next session in March about the code, the complaints process itself, because I know there's a lot of interest in that, and it's an opportunity for the committee to think about that next time and how we might improve that further. But tonight, I just wanted to focus on the code of conduct itself. So I'm not going to read what it says on that slide, but basically it applies to all councillors, without exception, and co-opted members of committees, and the detail of the code of conduct is set out in the council's constitution. So what's the purpose? Well, this is a straight lift out of the Borough Council's code of conduct, and those of you on the committee previously, when we last looked at the code of conduct, you'll recall that the Borough Council has adopted, with a couple of minor exceptions, the LGA's model code of conduct. So this really sort of just sets the scene in terms of why the code of conduct is important, and it is about protecting members. It is about protecting the reputation of the relevant authority, whether it's the Borough Council or towns and parishes, and it is important. So what are those 7 principles of public life? Again, I won't read those out. I think they're pretty self-evident. They apply to all local authorities, all public bodies, the government, and obviously those principles are quite topical at the moment, and there's various sort of public concern about the adherence to those principles. But Wokingham's Code of Conduct is very much sort of written, because it's the LGA Code of Conduct model, very much written with those 7 principles in mind. They seem quite high level, though, don't they? And sometimes it can be a bit theoretical. What does that really mean? I would say, from my point of view, for members, there's 3 things in particular to be aware of where members fall foul of the code. And the most important thing is that first one, the behaviours and the conduct. Probably 90%, I would say, in my experience, of complaints that come in are about conduct and behaviour. We do very periodically have complaints about members' register of interests, and infrequently we have complaints about how or whether members have appropriately declared their interests at meetings. But it's that conduct one that is the key focus. So I'm going to say a little bit about that now. So when a complaint comes in, the first test that I apply is whether the member who's the subject of the complaint was acting in their capacity as a councillor at the time that the complaint arose. And what you can see there is quite a comprehensive list of situations in terms of where it would be considered that the code applied and the types of different situations. What I would say is that I think with the new LGA model code of conduct, there's a greater expectation that you will be considered to be acting in capacity, more so than perhaps was the case a few years ago, where perhaps the public and private life was more distinct, and probably the main reason for that shift is social media. And I've highlighted in bold that point at the bottom of the slide there, that as you know, as a committee, that we've had an increasing number of complaints that are about members' conduct when using social media. And I think because social media is sort of all pervasive and it's a real 24/7 sort of operation, it does blur the line in terms of that capacity question. So that's the first test that I would apply. Moving on then to what does it actually say around conduct and behaviour in the code? Well, the model starts firstly talking about those 7 general principles. And again, you can see a very close correlation there with the sorts of statements to the Nolan principles. It's not quite a straight read across, but that's what those general principles in the code are relating to. But the code also has 7 specific standards of conduct as well. And when a member of the public or another councillor chooses to make a complaint, principally around conduct, they'll look at those 7 specific standards. And the 5 highlighted in blue, I've just sort of suggested that those are the 5, in my experience, again, that are most likely to be the reason that a complainant chooses to make a complaint. And I would say out of those 5 highlighted in blue, the first one, respect, is probably the most prominent, partly because it's a very general concept. The code does give definitions and does give some sort of helpful examples as to what that looks like, but respect is the one that most typically leads to complaints, particularly on social media, that a complainant feels that they've been disrespected by the words that a councillor has written. Less so with those other 4 blue, although the bullying, harassment and intimidation is often quite closely linked to respect. But the two on the right, though, use of position and use of local authority resources, again, in my experience there, it's relatively rare to get a complaint on those particular aspects. We haven't got time tonight to sort of delve into the detail of what each of them mean, although I can see Councillor Shepherd-Dubé's hand up, so I'm happy to take questions at the end, just when I've been through this, if there's anything specific there. Gifts and hospitality, again, in my memory, I can't recall a complaint coming in around this subject, but the rules that you set when you agreed the code of conduct set that limit at £25. And this is one of the variances from the model code, because the model code had £50. But those are the rules in terms of declaring gifts and hospitality. Just to finish up now around registering interests and declaring interests. So you'll know when you were elected as councillors that you had 28 days to complete your register of interests. But it's also important to stress that if your circumstances change during your tenure as a councillor, you've got 28 days from that change to register that change of interest. And that is really important, that you keep your registers up to date, particularly with regard to that second bullet there. So your disclosable pecuniary interests, which is a legal requirement for you to register, and it's a criminal offence if you don't. Again, in Wokingham, I can't recall an instance where we've had a complaint about a non-disclosure of a DPI, but it could happen, and those are very serious complaints if those come through. And then you've also got a requirement to register other registerable interests. So in terms of the disclosable pecuniary interests, there's a list of what they are. Most of them, I think, are pretty straightforward. Your employment, your home, land and property you own, contracts with your council, securities in companies. Hopefully most of those are pretty self-evident. I just wanted to say a little bit about the additional categories, and this is in the Wokingham Borough Council Code, but these are the other things that you need to include in your register. These are these other registerable interests. An example that I typically quote here is many members choose to register the fact of their membership of the National Trust. They'll put that on their register, but there may be other things like that that you would include. Membership of a political party as well, for example, would be an obvious example in this list. Just in terms of just finishing up now, in terms of you're in a meeting, what do you need to declare? Well, your DPIs, the disclosable pecuniary interests, you need to declare those, and you can't take place in a discussion or a decision making where you've got a DPI. But personal interests, or those other registerable interests, there's a definition of what they are. You do need to declare those at the start of the meeting or before an item is being discussed. But these are perhaps more of a grey area, because it depends on the particular circumstances of the item. So if the matter directly relates to your personal interest, then you mustn't be involved in the discussion or the decision making. But it's what does directly relates actually mean. So again, there's a test here set out in terms of what councillors would need to consider in terms of their participation or non-participation in a decision at a particular meeting. What I'd say about this is it's best to take advice, because every circumstance is different. You can't write a set of rules that would explicitly cover every circumstance around your personal interests. The other thing I would say is that it's down to the individual councillor, because only the individual councillor knows exactly what their personal interests are. But again, if in doubt, take advice. So I appreciate that was a very brief sort of canter through a few things out of the Code of Conduct, but I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions, Chair. And happy to take any feedback in terms of how you'd like these sort of sessions to run in the future. I'm conscious this is the first time that we've done something like this. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That was very clear, actually. Very, very good. Imogen, you had your hand up. You have a question.
I did, and he did say he didn't want to delve into details, but I'm interested to know how Andrew quantifies what respect is. Because offending people isn't necessarily disrespecting them, but and to me, it's, well, you know me, I like black and white thinking, so that's really where my question lies.
Yeah, so that could be an interesting take on that.
It's a really good question, and it is a grey area. The code does help. It does give some definition around that, and that would be the sort of first port of call that I'd have as monitoring officer to compare the situation and the experience and the feeling, because a lot of this is about people's feeling and how they've reacted to a certain thing. But I'd use the code of conduct as the first reference point. The other thing that I think is important to stress to the committee is that the role of the independent person. So I will have a perspective as monitoring officer, but it's really important to me to get the perspective of the independent person, because they are a representative of the community. They're not a politician. They're not an officer. They will give, again, in my experience, very sound, sage advice in terms of whether or not the particular situation merits further investigation in terms of that word respect and whether or not there's evidence. I'd also take into account the subject member's response to the complaint. Sometimes members may reflect on their conduct and may see that perhaps what they said or how they said it could have been construed as being disrespectful, and they would look to make a quick apology, a fulsome apology to the complainant. So it's hard to answer your question, Imogen, in sort of black and white terms, because these things typically are full of grey.
Yes, Chris, you have a question.
It's actually topical, actually. I just want to apologise for my tardiness and no reflection on your credibility. I do apologise for interrupting your presentation.
Right.
One question. I noticed at the beginning we have to make sure that everybody signs the code of conduct, including co-opted members. Does it also apply to members of the public co-opted onto a working group?
It applies to anybody co-opted onto a committee of the council. I think if it's a working group that's been constituted by the council, the answer would probably be yes. If it's a less formal working group, the answer would probably be no. It sounds like, I'm just listening to my answer myself there, it sounds like that's probably something that I need to take away and provide some more guidance on, so the particular circumstances where it would apply.
Yes, to be precise, I had in mind we have a subcommittee for the neighbourhood plan, and that consists of councillors only and takes financial decision amongst others. But there's a working group of councillors and members of the public. They have no spending powers. All their decisions have to be taken again by the councillor subcommittee. And that was the circumstance I was thinking of.
I wonder if quite a lot of this is very dependent on context and the specifics being discussed at the time.
Yeah, absolutely, Chair, but I will take the point away and I will come back with some more explicit guidance around that. And there were really helpful examples that you gave there in terms of the difference between two types of working groups.
Does anyone have any more questions? Sally.
You mentioned that you'd would be in our March meeting discussing the disciplinary process. I know over the last couple of years now, I think we've had some very specific feedback about changes that we wanted to make, some of which came out of the consultation which is now over a year old, I believe. Are we going to be having proposals coming to March, or are we using March to propose new things?
I think in terms of changes that were previously proposed, so I think we're going back perhaps 18 months or so ago now. So we had Paul Hoey from Hoey Associates, who was the expert, or is the expert in this area, and he made some suggestions in terms of our process. That went through the committee and was adopted by the council. Those changes in process. I would need to just double check that everything that went through the committee at the time did go through to council. So I suspect you may think otherwise, but I will check that there's nothing missing. Having said all that, certainly in March, when I describe our current process, there's an opportunity through this committee for you to make further changes to the process.
If I can, I think it's specifically relating to the informal process, and that is still listed in this agenda as being part of it, or in these backing papers. So we were talking about the informal process outcomes being reported. Whether that was a removal of the informal process or just that it ended up having the same reporting as the formal process, I haven't seen that anywhere since we agreed it at this committee.
So if I could just respond to that one. So yeah, I do recall that. So where a member was found to be in breach, but that was dealt with through the informal process, previously that member's name would not be disclosed. What you changed 12 months or so ago is the disclosure of that name. So that is in play. The reason that you've not seen any names disclosed is because we've not had those particular circumstances yet.
Brilliant. Thank you for confirming.
Does anybody else have anything they'd like to raise? Sheena?
Just to say thank you to Andrew. I think it would be useful to give timely reminders that we should keep the Register of Interests up to date. I'm not going to say why, but yeah, I need to add something to mine.
That's an interesting point, actually. It would be very easy to lose track of that. Speaking personally, there might be one or two things I need to look at. So, yeah, good point.
Yeah, we'll certainly take that away, and we probably can do more in terms of reminding members. But I would also say ultimately it's down to the individual member. Yeah, we might do an annual reminder, but if your circumstances changed during that year, it's down to you as the individual councillor to make sure you update your register.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? No? Well, Andrew, just thank you very much for your presentation and taking us through that. It's and again, from my point of view, it makes eminent sense, but it's always very good to be reminded and to hear it clearly. So thank you. Now I think we now move on to the update on the status of town and parish member codes of conduct, which I think I tried to do a little while earlier, but we'll do it properly now.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So Councillor Matthews made a particular request at the October meeting to provide information to the committee in terms of the status of our 17 town and parish councils and their code of conduct. What I set out in the appendix, which is at page 12, is the current status of 16 of the towns and parishes. And I would just like to say tonight, I've been in touch with Woking and Without, who, when I finished this report, I hadn't got their information, but they've confirmed that their code of conduct was updated in May 2022. So what you see there, I think, is a pretty reasonable picture in terms of the majority of towns and parishes. Certainly the 3 town councils and the larger parishes have relatively recently considered, updated, reviewed their member code of conduct. I think there's a small handful of the smaller parishes going back to perhaps 2015 since they last updated their code. But overall, I think it's a pretty positive picture. What the recommendation is asking the committee tonight is just to consider that update at Appendix 1 on page 12 and advise me of any particular follow-up actions or any further support that you would ask me to provide to individual town and parish councils. What I would add is just with that caveat that there is only one of me and there's 17 towns and parishes, so my capacity is relatively limited, but happy to take any comments and suggestions that the committee has got.
And Imogen.
Sorry, it's me again. What reasons have these places like Winnersh and Shinfield and Hurst and Swallowfield, they've not updated their code of conduct for quite a while, or reviewed it by the looks of things? Or have they reviewed it, or have they updated it, or do we know what their status is and why they haven't done anything?
I've not really got any further information other than what's on that appendix, but I'm happy to take a conversation on with those parishes, particularly the ones that are talking about 2015, since they last updated or reviewed their
just
code.
make sure they've checked it and looked at it. I think rather than just ignored it.
Right, thank you. And Sally, did you have a question?
I mean, more or less the same thing, but I think there are 6 that are older than the LGA model and early. I'm curious about early. It says they've adopted it in November 2020, but the same as the Borough Council, but the Borough Council adopted it officially in July. So which version are they using? Does it matter?
It's a good question. I'll follow that up with the clerk of early.
Right, thank you. Right, so are there any more questions? In which case we could move to the recommendation that the Standards Committee considers the update at Appendix 1 and advises the monitoring officer of any follow-up actions and or further support for individual or parish councils. So am I right in thinking then that with the 2 comments we've just heard, that's what we need to take now? So do we need to vote?
Yes, quickly.
All in favour? Any not? Carried. Thank you. So agenda item 26, and again, I'm looking to you, Andrew, on this one.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the usual update on complaints report. So I just wanted to give you the headlines and then I'll take any questions on this. So since the last meeting of the committee in October, we've had 2 new complaints, but both of which were found to be no breach. What I should say is since this report was published, so last week, I have received a further complaint. So just for the record, I've very recently received another complaint. You'll see in the detail on page 17 that we've got 1 complaint at the moment that is at the investigation stage. That complaint, or it says the complaint is at investigation stage and is complete apart from subject members' final responses. That's WBC 6. And I expect to have the investigators report by the end of the month, in other words, next week on that. So we're nearly there in terms of that particular process. In terms of the historic complaints that you questioned me about last time, so these are Woodley Town Council complaints, you'll see on page 19 that we've now got just 3 complaints left to deal with. They're being reviewed by legal services, the final review with legal services in terms of those. Just to put this into context, we were talking about 7 historic complaints with Woodley. So we're down to 3, and I would very much hope by the time of the next meeting, which I think is at the start of March, in just a month's time, that I'll be able to report a positive outcome or an outcome to those 3 remaining complaints at Woodley as well. Thank you, Chair.
Well, that does sound like good progress. Thank you. So I see we have to. So any further questions or any points people would like to raise on that? No. In which case, I think we're just asked to note the update on complaints. And I think have we finished considering any matters arising? Are we done with that? Thank you, Sylvia. That's fine. Thank you. So I think the next thing I feel is any items of particular urgency. Am I correct in that?
You don't have any?
I don't think I have any. I'm hoping, can I say this? I'm hoping that nobody here has any particularly urgent items. No? Well, in that case, I think we've declared the meeting closed. And can I just thank everybody for the speed with which we managed to do that, because I know this was a tricky evening for everyone. Thank you.